Welcome everybody to our student panel. We're still missing a student. I hope she comes soon. My name is David Scott. For those of you who I haven't introduced myself to earlier, I teach in the communication department here at Utah Valley University, and my interest is in the area of religion, media, and popular culture. I teach a class called Mormons, Media and Popular Culture, in fact, that looks at both identity and belonging and meaning making and language and so on. And my wife teaches international students, so I've always made it. It's important to me to always reach out to people of varying religions and belief systems, from the very devout to atheists, and recognize the humanity and brotherhood and sisterhood in all of us as fellow journeyers on this planet. So I'm grateful for all of you coming here today. And let's see, I don't know if the order is from left to right or right to left. I guess it does it from left to right. Okay, perfect. So I'll let the students introduce themselves today and share some of their thoughts on the subject that we have been discussing throughout this day, which is the intersection of religion and politics in America. If I could just remind all of you, please, to keep the mics relatively close so that you can be heard, because we are streaming this and recording this. Okay. All right. And you each have about 10 minutes. Do you need a timer, or y'all good? Y'all good? You got it.
Oh, no, I don't know.
You can just cut us off if we go too far.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right. Okay. Please introduce yourselves and start from there. Thank you.
Our left to right, or your left?
We'll start with Danny.
Okay. Well, I don't know what introduce yourself entails, but my name is Danny Chan. I'll just hop right into my paper. The topic of exploring religion and politics is a topic that can and has been discussed and dissected since the founding of our nation. And since I don't have 250 years to speak, but only about 10 minutes, as established, I've decided to focus on the parts of the First Amendment that address religion and how its original interpretations and intentions have shifted over time. My objective being to define certain terms and provide historical context in an effort to better understand the role of religion in American politics. The First Amendment of the Bill of Rights was passed by Congress in 1789 and ratified in 1791. The beginning, and what I will be focusing on, reads as follows, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," end quote. Due to the phrasing, two distinct clauses concerning religious freedom emerge, known as the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, respectively. In the Establishment Clause, it prohibits the government from legally favoring any one religion over another, favoring religion over non-religion, or promoting or hindering any religion through laws, policies, or finances. Essentially, the government is not allowed to interfere in religious practice or affairs. Then comes the Free Exercise Clause, which protects the citizens, allowing them to freely practice and engage in the religion of their choice without the threat of discrimination or legal consequences. These definitions I provided are grounded in the principles of our founding father, James Madison, who not only wrote the First Amendment, but was one of the most influential figures regarding the development and implementation of religious liberty in America. In his original draft of the First Amendment, he writes, quote, "The civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or in any pretext infringed," end quote. This equal right of conscience is the freedom to choose and act upon one's own moral beliefs, which for Madison and all the other founding fathers is a natural right, meaning it is established in our Declaration of Independence and Constitution. Oh, I skipped a line, I'm so sorry. Meaning it is a fundamental aspect of human nature and cannot justly be taken away. And because of the values established in our Declaration of Independence and Constitution, it is a right that must be legally protected. Religious liberty in this context is just one expression of an individual's broader right to freedom of conscience. When viewed from the perspective and intentions of the founding fathers, the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses become two sides of the same coin, both working together towards the same goal of protecting human beings' natural rights. The Establishment Clause is intended to prevent the forming of a national church and maintain religious neutrality within the government, which then fulfills the necessary conditions for the Free Exercise Clause, which is intended to protect religious freedoms and diversity for the individual. It's worth noting, however, that the First Amendment only applied to the federal government until the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. And even then, the Supreme Court didn't officially declare that the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses applied to state governments until the 1900s. Even though at this time all states had abolished established religion, this is an important distinction to keep in mind while analyzing the First Amendment and how it applies to religion, because the diversity and pluralism, and consequently, the social and political culture found within America has changed significantly throughout the years, despite Christianity consistently being the majority. One of the more influential turning points came with the decision made in 1947 in the case of Everson versus the Board of Education, where the Supreme Court's ruling decided that the Establishment Clause applied to states in addition to the federal government. Justice Hugo Black wrote, quote, "The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach," end quote. Multiple prominent political and philosophical figures, namely Roger Williams, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, had already previously used the verbiage of church and state in the context of keeping them separate. But in this case, the Supreme Court brought the idea of separation of church and state into an official legal capacity. This contributed significantly to the more recent interpretation of the Establishment Clause as the complete absence of anything religious in the public square. The practical application of religion within the guidelines of the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses is consistently a topic of polarizing debate. In contemporary times, America has seen a surge in what is known as de facto establishment, which is when the government, through its actions and/or its policies, favors one religion or one religious set of values over another without a formal legal declaration and acknowledgement thereof. Three of the primary arguments in many of the cases brought to court are: first, the government recognizing or participating in anything of a religious nature. For example, the Pledge of Allegiance being required to be recited in public school, despite the text "One Nation under God," or legislative prayer to open a town meeting. Second, religious symbols being displayed in the public square, like the Nativity during Christmas or the menorah during Hanukkah. And third, religious affiliations being allowed to receive public funding, like parents being reimbursed by the government for transportation costs to religious schools, or a Catholic school becoming a charter school, which is a case that's actually slated to be debated in the Supreme Court April 30th of this year. Many Americans, about 20% of adults, according to a recent Pew Research Center census, have legitimate concerns about the rise of these de facto religious establishments, especially Christian nationalism, since the majority of issues arising and cases heard by the Supreme Court are cases about Christian nationalism and Christianity, which remains the dominant majority in the United States. The justifiable argument being made is that certain denominations are violating the Establishment Clause, which ultimately infringes on the freedoms and rights of other citizens. However, according to another survey recently conducted by the Pew Research Center, about 16% of Americans think that the government's separation of church and state has been taken too far. Also justifiably, the argument is made that the absolute separation of church and state violates the Free Exercise Clause by infringing on an organization's or individual's right to openly and freely practice religion, including those individuals who hold positions in government office. The contemporary interpretation of the Establishment Clause is used to justify people's efforts to shut down or eliminate religion from the public square completely, and at the same time, the contemporary interpretation of the Free Exercise Clause is used to justify the most extreme actions, pushing one individual's or denomination's beliefs above or on others. In the majority of these de facto establishment cases, the verdicts are seen as either ruling in favor of the Establishment Clause or in favor of the Free Exercise Clause. This polarized political climate creates an environment where the role of religion in American politics is treated as hostile, making their coexistence unsustainable in practice. So what, if any, is the proposed solution? In 1988, a group of 100 prominent figures, including former presidents, academic scholars, medical professionals, and even members of various religious denominations, came together to sign a declaration that reaffirmed the importance of and intentions behind the First Amendment's religious liberty clauses. In this document, known as the Williamsburg Charter, the definition of the Establishment Clause is redefined to better align with the Founding Fathers' original intentions. Quote, the No Establishment Clause separates church from state, but not religion from politics or public life. It prevents the confusion of religion and government, which has been a leading source of repression and coercion throughout history, end quote. The Williamsburg Charter also outlines 3 key requirements in order to achieve the end goal of, quote, reconstitution of a free republican people in our day, end quote. First, a shared moral code in common ground that supersedes political ideology, where diverse groups of people can engage in democratic life without infringing on each other's rights. Second, a firm appreciation and commitment for the framework of the Constitution, emphasizing mutual respect and responsibility towards each other and towards the betterment of the nation. And third, a personal civic virtue, where individuals foster qualities like tolerance, integrity, and restraint within themselves. By focusing our efforts on these requirements, religion can be given the opportunity to assume a healthy role in American politics. According to our founding fathers and the Williamsburg Charter, religion is an integral and necessary part of public life and politics. Even James Madison, who is already established to be highly in favor of the separation of church and state, acknowledged that religion in the public square was not just inevitable, but in fact encouraged. But first, the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses need to once again be understood as 2 parts of a whole, where, quote, the government acts as a safeguard but not the source of freedom for faiths, and the churches and synagogues act as a source but not the safeguard of faiths for freedom. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm a first-year student here at UVU, and I'm very excited to talk to you guys today. Um, Forgive me if I look down. I am keeping time because I tend to talk really fast when I get nervous, so I want to make sure that I'm doing it right. Um, Today, the topic that I am going to be talking to you guys about is Christian nationalism, and specifically American Christian nationalism and its relationship with the First Amendment. So, as of this year, the Pew Research Center found that 62% of adults in America identify themselves as Christian. On our money is printed "In God We Trust," and we speak of one nation under God in our Pledge of Allegiance. We are considered to many a Christian nation. This is neither a good or a bad thing, but a label, an observation. However, there are facets of American Christianity that can be harmful, and one that I'm going to speak to today is American Christian nationalism. The thesis that I'll be discussing today is the Christian nationalist worldview in the United States at times runs contrary to the rights protected in the First Amendment. America is celebrated as the land of the free. The First Amendment details several of these important freedoms: freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. America also generally regards itself as a Christian nation, which many citizens take pride in. However, when the narrative of the United States becomes singular, it becomes exclusionary. So, when American Christian nationalist perspectives start to lean towards the erasure of other religions and worldviews as they glorify their own, the rights contained in the First Amendment begin to be in question. So first, we got to talk about the First Amendment. Danny already did a fantastic job. The First Amendment, ratified and added to the U.S. Constitution in 1791, reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The most important parts of this for our discussion today are the protection for religion and speech. It's important to note that the religion section of the First Amendment is split into 2 clauses. First, the Establishment Clause. The government cannot endorse or establish a national religion, meaning no religion should be given preferential treatment over others. Second, the Free Exercise Clause. Citizens have the right to practice their religion without interference. It's that first section of the First Amendment that American Christian nationalism can pose a threat to. The 2 clauses included in religious freedom and free speech. Now, it's important that we define American Christian nationalism before we really dig in. First, Christian nationalism is a form of religious nationalism that is focused on promoting Christian views and achieving prominence of Christian belief in political, social, and cultural life. There are many breeds within Christian nationalism, but since our scope today is the United States, I will be speaking specifically about American Christian nationalism. Generally speaking, American Christian nationalists believe that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and that Christian beliefs and practices should be embedded within all aspects of society. Like its parent Christian nationalism, American Christian nationalism nationalism also comes in many shapes and forms, in many strains, and in varying intensities. With my time today, I'm just going to focus on the extreme side of it, the belief that the Christian God is the only thing that should be influencing behavior and policy in the United States, and that other gods or belief systems are not as valid or even valid at all, where Christian nationalism threatens to slip into outright Christian supremacy. American Christian nationalism and the First Amendment have been used in conjunction before. In fact, a very common defense of American Christian nationalism is the First Amendment itself because of its protections around the practicing of religion. After all, why shouldn't someone be able to express pride and love for Christianity if that's what they believe in? Doesn't the First Amendment make sure of that? The answer to that question is yes, but. Yes, the First Amendment protects the practice of religion and protects free speech in expressing pride and belief in it. However, it provides those protections equally to every single religion. This is where the Establishment Clause comes in. If Christianity is being used as the religion of the United States and we are erasing, ignoring, or harming other religions and perspectives, we are now at odds with the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. The point at which Christian nationalism is used to steamroll other beliefs is the point at which the First Amendment stops protecting Christian nationalism. To better understand this discussion, we also need to revisit and understand the ideologies from which America was born. The roots of the American experiment are liberal, classically liberal, a doctrine that emphasizes individual liberty and autonomy, equality of opportunity, and of rights. They are also very pluralist, built on the philosophy of diversity, on the idea of multiples coexisting. The United States was to be a place where we could conduct experiments in living and gain enrichment from our differences. The problem with American Christian nationalism is that it can seek to turn the country away from those original ideals in favor of a more homogenized society. Christian nationalists actively seek to enshrine certain Christian Protestant practices, beliefs, and perspectives while excluding religious others. Dr. Walker talked about othering, and I thought it was really relevant. These measures are to explicitly guide law, education, business, entertainment, media, etc. It is to bleed into every sector of American life. An example of this is the Seven Mountain Mandate, which was also mentioned in their talks earlier today. The Seven Mountain Mandate, it was an evangelical movement that emerged in the 1970s and advocated for Christian control in the 7 key spheres of influence in society: religion, family, education, government, business, media, and arts and entertainment. Essentially, it is a model for achieving Christian supremacy. Movements and beliefs like the Seven Mountain Mandate can run contrary to the First Amendment, violating both the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Perspectives like this run contrary to the Establishment Clause because they seek to appoint Christianity as the religion of the United States while ostracizing or ignoring religious others. They run contrary to the Free Exercise Clause and to the freedom of speech protected in the First Amendment because they are pursuing a singular Christian narrative. It actively marginalizes and silences those who do not match the American Christian nationalist ideal. You may be thinking, yeah, this sucks, but the perspective of a few people in the country isn't legislation. Why is the First Amendment relevant if it's not in legislation? And while these are not laws being written by the federal government against religious others, societal pressures can function nearly the same. If a person does not speak freely or won't practice their religion freely for fear of being ostracized or marginalized, it is just as much in opposition to the First Amendment as if it had been signed into law. One example of harmful American Christian nationalism was the disruption of a Senate prayer in July of 2007. A guest chaplain was invited to give a prayer to open a session of Congress. His name was Rajan Zed, and he was the first Hindu to be invited to perform this honor. Right as he began to pray, he was interrupted by a Christian man in the room standing and praying loudly to his own God, calling Rajan's prayer wicked and an abomination and pleading for forgiveness. As Rajan continued, he was interrupted twice more by shouted prayers from Christians. After they were removed from the room, he was able to give his prayer, making congressional history. The people disrupting the service were exhibiting harmful American Christian nationalism contrary to the First Amendment. They believed strongly that a different belief had no place in Congress, that it was un-American, and that it needed to be stopped. In this way, American Christian nationalism is combative to the First Amendment, fighting against the recognition of and free practice of a religion because it is not Christian and thus cannot be considered American. Now, it is important to note that Christian nationalism is not always at odds with the First Amendment. In general, it's a framework of thinking that aims to promote Christianity within many aspects of American life. There is a strain of Christian nationalism, however, that exists in violation of the First Amendment, and that strain is present when Christian nationalism crosses from pride into erasure and begins to step on the toes of religious others. Christian nationalism is very present in the United States and is thus something we should all strive to be aware of. These ideals are not limited to the fringes of society. They can and have become ingrained into our laws, policies, and life in the public square. As we navigate the complexities of American religious and political culture, it is important to remain open minded and as educated as possible. The freedom to practice our beliefs, whether Muslim, Jewish, Christian, secular, or otherwise, must be safeguarded. Protecting the First Amendment requires us to actively promote inclusivity and resist attempts to enshrine one belief system at the expense of others. In doing so, we can protect the freedom to believe as we choose and ensure that, pluralist, sorry, in doing so, we can protect the freedom to believe as we choose and ensure that the pluralist diversity of thought, faith, and expression remains a cornerstone of our nation's identity. Thank you.
Okay. First, I just want to say thanks to Danny and Hannah. They set me up beautifully. They kind of took all of the hard work for me, so now I can kind of just talk to you guys. I don't really have a paper prepared, so this is just kind of, I mean, I have some thoughts prepared. I didn't come unprepared, don't worry. But I'll just introduce myself really quickly. My name's Carter Thorpe. I'm a junior here at UVU studying PR and marketing. And I've had a couple of different experiences doing different stuff in the political realm. I was a part of the We the People administration. They do it all throughout Utah. And I was able to go to nationals in high school, so that was really exciting. But rather than kind of, lecturing you guys and telling you guys, I mean, like I said, they did an incredible job on setting us up on how we even understand these kind of things. But kind of talking about what do we do? How are we supposed to, as especially young Americans, take an effort to, make those steps that we need to take to make sure that we're making a change in whatever way you want it to change. So the first thing that I want to cover is just like, what is the role of young people in changing religious discourse? I mean, this is something that has been happening, like Danny said, for hundreds of years. And we could sit up here for hours and go through every single thing that's happened in history and be able to touch on different points of where religious discourse has changed. But it's thousands of different points. It's changing today. And I think that the first question that a lot of people want to ask is, how are young people redefining the conversation around religion? And I think that the first thing is just admitting that, yes, young people are changing this conversation. And a lot of it has to do with just prioritizing inclusivity and also prioritizing just social justice in general. Whether, wherever on the political scale you lie, sorry, pardon me, there are different things that you're prioritizing, right? And I think that a lot of times religious discourse is something that a lot of people like to shirk around and they get nervous. And I think that the first thing is just making people aware that, social justice and reform is something that a lot of young Americans are incredibly interested in taking part of. And something that I want to bring up is it's called the Movement Advancement Project. And I'd love if you guys went and looked at it after the conference. But it's something that I've been able to kind of not exactly be a part of, but kind of participate in for the last couple of years. As somebody who is LGBTQ plus, especially in Utah, it's hard to, find your place. And this specific website kind of lets you know what your protections are. A lot of people don't know, but depending on state to state kind of depends on what protections you have, especially as somebody in that community. And as you go through, it'll tell you even like what percentage of legislation is for or against you as a member of that community. Now you might be wondering, like, what does this have to do with religious discourse? There is a very apparent switch where, religion is prevalent in states where there are just less protections. And I think that this is something that is completely anti what it should be, right? I mean, religion is supposed to be all encompassing. It's supposed to bring people into spaces that, you're able to express yourself. And I think that, it's kind of disparaging that that's happening. And then the next question that a lot of people want to ask is like, okay, so let's say that I want to get involved in changing religious discourse. What are the steps that I need to take? Like, what does it mean for the younger generation to get involved with this? And I think that something that I like to think about is, like I mentioned, focusing on community over conformity. I think that a lot of times people are worried about fitting inside of a box, especially when it comes to whatever religion they're practicing. And I think that something that's really cool and something that I've discovered as I've been researching for this presentation is that online Christian communities are becoming a thing. And that's something that, if you were to tell someone 100 years ago, they'd say, what does that even mean? But like having a space where, okay, maybe I'm not exactly looking for X, Y, and Z. I'm not exactly looking to conform in this way, but you're having a place where you can worship how you want to worship. And they're popping up all over. I mean, there's apps that you can get on. There's different kinds of websites that you can, join, like mass or a congregation where you can be a part of something. And I think that that's something that, like, especially conservative Christian values are incredibly afraid of. And I think that not having control over someone and not being able to force them to conform because they're supposed to is something that they're afraid of. And, whether that's something that you want to be a part of or not, sometimes it can give you guidance in life. It's something that you should at least be aware of, and something that you should realize that we're not supposed to force this on people. The next thing that I kind of want to go over, and Danny and Hannah did this beautifully, but kind of talking about the difference between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Right now, there's just this effort, especially in this recent administration, to kind of blur the line between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And I think that a lot of people wonder, like, how can I take advantage of the Constitution to fight against this in specific? And just making sure, like, that we are keeping our constitutional values at the forefront of our mind, especially when it comes to a nation that prioritizes it so heavily, or they say that they do. And I think that, like, a lot of people don't realize that these laws, this legislation, these things that are happening are just straight up discriminatory and unconstitutional at the end of the day. There's not really a lot that you can do to defend it. And when you really dig into it, it's happening and it's present, especially this last year. And so I think that, like, we can look back and we're like, okay, well, we have the Supreme Court, like, that's what's supposed to protect us. And we can look back at different Supreme Court cases like Engel v. Vitale, or, there's hundreds of different, well, not hundreds, but lots of Supreme Court cases that protect religious liberty, right? But I think that we have to realize, like, especially with the administrations that we're working with now, the protections of the Supreme Court are going to start becoming less and less. And it's going to become something that, not that we should be afraid of, but that we should be ready to combat. And I don't think that, and this is a scary thing to think about, but I don't know if we're always going to have those things protected by the Supreme Court as much as we'd like them to be. So making sure that we're fighting from the ground level. The last thing that I want to touch on just really quickly is just this difference between belief and belonging. I think that a lot of times, like, especially with the younger generation, it's more about belonging in a space rather than having a belief. And, not everybody's going to agree with that, and that's fine. But, like, how does the shift away from people wanting to practice organized religion affect just the future political climate of the United States as a whole? And I think that that's a question that I can't even give an answer to right now, because we're watching it happen in real time. And it's going to be something that over the next couple of administrations, over the next couple of years, we're going to be able to see this happen in real time, which is really interesting. And I think that it's something that, whether you're looking forward to it or not, it's something to keep an eye on. And I think that the biggest thing for me is just this immediate and required decline of religious authority in policymaking. And I think that making sure that we're letting secular voices rise up in politics is something that's going to be able to save us from this blur that we all talked about, really, of the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, making sure that we're protecting that liberty. I loved your analogy with the two-sided coin. I think that's beautiful. I think that making sure that we're emphasizing that, yes, they're supposed to work together. They're not these two separate things that are fighting against each other, but they do keep each other in check. And I think that just, like, the last thing, a lot of us, especially as the younger generation, as we're getting the opportunity to vote, like, we're at a university, we're in a place where we're voting for things all the time, right? And making sure that, like, a lot of times the changes happen on your local level, whether it's participating in an election where you're like, I don't even know who any of these people on my ballot are, but making sure that you take advantage of that. And, whether it's you running for, like, political office, to make sure that you can make the changes that you want to make, but making sure that you're voting for someone who is all encompassing of what you think Americans' values actually stand for. And then I think, like, the last thing that I just want to close with is just, like, educating yourself from sources. And Dave kind of touched on this earlier, but, like, educating yourself in sources that that are truthful, that are here to present the news, present the media, present the things that are, laid out in the Constitution. The founding fathers would be horrified to know of all of the fake news that's kind of coming around. And I think that the biggest thing is just, like I said, educate yourself, be active in elections, make sure that you're taking care of yourself and also taking care of the people around you who may not have the voice that you think that they have. Thanks.
Okay. I'm not sure how this mic stands. Oh, is it on?
Here, take this
Thank
one.
you. Cool. All right. So, hi, I'm Lucia Morelli. I'm a first year here as well. And my topic is less related. It's a bit more tangential. It was a lot more discussed in the panel before us regarding how it's incredibly difficult to bring someone who's deeply entrenched in this Christian MAGA rhetoric to our side to understand the harm that they're doing. And so my proposal as to why that is what I'm going to be calling for now. It might not be correct. the white Christian phantasm. And by phantasm, I don't mean a ghostly specter or whatnot, but in the philosophical definition, using an interpretation of Plato's definition of the word, which was an imperfect version of reality through one's imagination. This is a definition used by philosophers like Judith Butler as a refraction of reality using one's own personal worldview and a bit of ignorance sprinkled in there. So, phantasms are typically deployed to soothe anxieties and to spur cognitive dissonance, to be able to glaze over it. And so, why do we allow these representations of reality to run rampant, to lead to attacks and insurrections? And surely we should be applying more logical thought processes here, right? So, for this presentation, I'd like to explore a little bit on how this phantasm works and its applications to things like white fragility, attempts to legitimize the structures of our society using this phantasm and how it reinforces its structure within our American lens, and our false acceptance of how this, our false acceptance of this grouping of American diversity and its applications to the First Amendment. So, the phantasm of white Christianity reflects white Christianity as the default American citizen and creates a false belief in a meritocracy, a society of equal individuals. This is brought into the forefront by the Christian God's want for a holy Christian world, despite the harm and restrictions it would cause or may have already caused on others. This can make it a bit difficult for someone to understand why they would not choose to follow a Christian faith, and especially more restrictive sectors such as Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses. This ignorance of others' pain, combined with structural racism and the blind spot of whiteness that is created by the thought process of colorblindness, is a key factor in the creation of white fragility, which could be deemed a result of this phantasm. White fragility, as described by Robin DiAngelo, is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defense moves. And to add to that, it's the uninterrogated nature of whiteness and colorblindness, leading to mistaking the comforts afforded by whiteness for safety, which creates claims that someone is unsafe when confronted with these contradictions in their logic. White fragility is one of the many defense strategies, here specifically ignorance, to soothe the manufactured anxiety that's created when this comfort and the creation of it is brought into question. Not only this, but there are ways that science and religion have joined forces in both past and present to legitimize white supremacy in America, despite our recent attempts to dismantle it. In the very early Christianity, the curse of Ham, Canaan, whatever you like, was used in very early days to secure the top spot of white Christians in the sliding scale of humanity's value, with white Christians on the top and non-Christians of color the furthest from God. Throughout history, these attempts to legitimize or naturalize white Christians at the top of the scale grew further from the Bible but still retained some of their rhetoric. To point to a few historical examples, we've got Immanuel Kant, very famous philosopher. He was Christian and has his idea of the four races, which I won't go into, but it's really weird. He taught at many Christian universities and claimed these races and their traits as science. And to bring it maybe like 100 years forward, we've got Friedrich Nietzsche, who was very famous for despising Christianity, but truly believed that only white people could undergo the personal psychological transformation described in a lot of his works, and it is being sold to this day as self-help, which, yes, but it's very hard to ignore the anti-Semitism that's strung throughout it. And I don't think I have to explain the recent things like the ICE raids and the revoking of citizenship status and our current political climate for someone to understand that these principles are still being applied today in similar ways in a little bit of a different font. And with an extra shout out to Project 2025, if you read the document, it's very open about America being a Christian nation and wanting non-believers and heretics out of the country. This reinforces the distortion of the phantasm with misinterpretations of history, science, and the very fabric of reality, shaping what looks to be reason to somebody who's deeply in its grasp. It isn't hard to see the issues caused by creating a country for white Christians by white Christians, but there's still the lingering question of why is it hard for people who are a part of MAGA, for instance, too? And this is partially due to the illusion of acceptance. In just the past 100 years, there's been a lot of progress for different Christian denominations to begin the act of tolerance with other faiths, and with interfaith conferences becoming more and more normalized, many Christians were usually the leaders of these sessions and often held a superiority during them. When it comes to tolerance of other faiths, it's not uncommon for Christians to claim that they find themselves tolerant of them, and that they don't often mind when others believe in a different God, and this illusion tends to shatter when put into practice. To give a historical example, in 1878 there was a swath of Chinese immigrants, which drew concern to the leaders who believed in America as a white Christian nation. In order to combat this stress, the decision was to send Christian missionaries to China to cleanse them of their robes before sending them off to America, with equating Christian as regarding being Christian as more white. And as mentioned in a couple panels ago, this was while the free white clause was still in place to garner citizenship. There are, of course, many other examples of this, from McCarthyism to the Indian Assimilation and Removal Act, but the point still stands. Where is the First Amendment in all of this? And it's still so common for people to cite the Founding Fathers as the reason America is a Christian nation, but hardly seems to be the case given the words of the Constitution, and much of our one nation under God rhetoric comes from McCarthyism and the Red Scare of the 40s, so it's not the original works of our country's founding. However, this false historical reinforcement seems to only add to the refractions of the phantasm. But to conclude, it's not difficult to find this white Christian phantasm in everyday life. It must be added, however, that phantasms are not unavoidable. There are many that we all deploy in daily life, and most of them are harmless. It's only when these distorted fantasies are brought to the forefront, used as fact, that they cause issue. However, it's always a good idea to reflect on one's own beliefs and take a look at the effects they have on others, and to understand what they've done throughout history or what they've done to people close to you. You may just be surprised what you find. Thank you.
Thank you. How about we do it this way? This is the one time I get to ask all the questions, if that's okay. So I'm going to ask each of you a different question. Okay, and I'm going to give you a heads up. I'm going to let you all think about it for a minute. We'll start with Lucia. Did I say that right? Did I say your name right? Okay. My question for you, and you can all mull on the other questions. I'll let everyone mull on these. My question for you is, how do you respond to legislation that is intended on removing history or controversial elements that, quote unquote, make certain people feel bad about their race, right? Referencing white people in particular. Now, you can think about that for a minute while I'm going to hand these questions down, and then, okay, so that Carter. There is some research, and this is correlation, but not causation, but does demonstrate that both within the United States, more secular states tend to have more freedom and lower crime rates. Also, more secular countries in Europe tend to have lower crime rates and a better system. So my question for you then is, given that we live in a more conservative environment, especially, you were mentioning the conservative sorts of Christian states, in particular in Utah, how do you go about navigating your own experience and identity as a young adult and making your voice heard a little bit? So that's your question. Hannah, you talked a little bit about the First Amendment not being able to address or social pressure and social issues, right? Social media is a great example, right? Privately owned companies. So the First Amendment, we all know, only applies to the government regulations, right? Only the government is not allowed to regulate freedom of speech. So my question for you is, it seems that the First Amendment is somewhat flawed or not fully meeting up to what we need it to do. So how would you address this idea of enhancing pluralism and allowing a greater marketplace of ideas, especially in an era of social media where you can have these, monolithic ideas being spread without any insight whatsoever, or regulation? Okay, Danny. My question for you is just, you talked a little bit about both the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, and I would like for you to perhaps give us an example of how might we better address those when they're in conflict with one another. And so the example I'm going to give to you is the argument that is made by a lot of local religious communities that are pulling to ban books and pull books out of schools, right? They are arguing that this violates their religious rights as parents to teach their children certain values. But on the other hand, right, we have a First Amendment that should be protecting those books and some of that speech, even if it is seen as antithetical to those religious ideas. So my question for you is, how do you want to balance that? Once you guys answer these questions, you're going to have solved all our problems here in the United States, and we'll be very grateful. Okay, so we'll start with Lucia.
Okay. Do you mind repeating the question? Sorry.
Oh, sure, no. So how do you respond to arguments in terms of legislation that is saying we should remove content or curriculum that makes people feel bad about their white race in particular?
My response to that is that no part of history should be cut, no matter, how do I want to put this? There's a lot of disguised language in the regards to the law in general. For example, some recent versions of it would be like ending DEI or economic boosting programs, etc. And with many misinterpretations of race theory and how this all goes about, I do think that it would make more sense to keep these things in terms of like colonization and the harm it's done throughout history, if that makes sense.
So just how would you respond maybe in a sentence or two to people who are saying that that sort of discourse, right, like teaching about race and history is racist in and of itself because it's making some people feel, right, bad?
Shoot.
Mull it over while everyone else
Please.
answers. Okay, go ahead, Carter.
Can you just repeat my question again as well?
Carter, sorry, I shouldn't have done it this way. I'm realizing.
No, you're fine.
So we were talking about how secular states tend to have more protections and freedoms than conservative or religious states, nationally and internationally. So how do you go about navigating your own identity and find your voice in a state such as Utah, where there tends to be more of a bias against you?
Leave. Just kidding. I mean, as somebody who was born and raised here, it's something that was kind of subconscious my whole entire life. I mean, I didn't realize that it was happening. And luckily I have a family who, they've been incredibly supportive of me, and they want me to be able to find myself and be my own person. But that's not the same story for everyone. And as much as I wish that it could be, I think that like being able to find people who do support you and find people inside of a state where it can seems even just scary to be here, scary to live, scary to walk around, scary to, just do a lot of things that, in other states, it's just not something that they think about. And not to say that discrimination or unfairness happens only here. I mean, it happens everywhere. We're watching it happen. And so I think that, being able to find a common ground with, loved ones or people who, you interact with every single day, who might just be straight up against who you are as a person. And finding this common ground of like, okay, you might not accept me for who I am, and you might not accept me or what I believe. But like, I still love you. Like, I still want this to be a thing. I still want to be able to like support each other in how it is. And I mean, here it happens way more often than it would anywhere else. And kind of bring up your point of like even crime rates, just random things that are happening between the difference between, religious states and secular states. It's just apparent that even if somebody holds like a really high Christian value or a really high religious value and they're in office, leaving it at the door and coming in to work every single day and being like, I need to do what's best for the people as a whole, not what's best for who I think are my people. Because I think that a lot of times they try to draw this line between me as a Christian, I represent X, Y, and Z. Me as, whatever religion, I represent these people. And making sure that it's not, I'm not just representing a minority. And as much as that is important to represent a minority, especially in politics, remember that at the end of the day, you're representing everyone as a whole, which includes the majority as well.
Thanks, Carter.
Okay, I wrote your questions down, so hopefully you don't need to repeat them. I kind of split it into two parts. The first part was kind of like, do you think that the First Amendment is maybe flawed because it's only applying to the government? Um, and the short answer is yes. I don't think that there is such thing as perfect legislation. Because, as we've heard, as there's been a theme from our panelists today, people are very fluid, people are dynamic, religions are dynamic, cultures are dynamic. And so it would be impossible to create perfect legislation, and it would immediately change. So I do think that the First Amendment is flawed. I don't think that that means it's bad. Um, but I think that where it kind of gets this flaw is that um, the First Amendment holds government to a certain standard. Um, and I think the goal was then to have like the rest of the country like follow suit and follow that ideal. And right now the ideal is not equating with the reality. And so I think that that leads to the second part of your question, which is how can we encourage pluralism with social media? And I think that the best way to do that is to engage in pluralism, um, to share what makes you different, to be loud about your story, about yourself, about your culture, and to disengage from things that are purposefully polarizing. Because I know we're all media literate. I know that we all spend time on the internet, and we can recognize things that are made to rage bait us and to draw emotional reactions from us. And so we can encourage pluralism by disengaging from that sort of media, and by calling out your friends if they participate in that kind of thing. And so I think being aware and educated is one part of it, but being willing to take action is the second half of it.
Great, thank you. Danny?
I didn't write your question down. So if I remember it correctly, it was just the idea you gave a specific case of wanting to take books out of certain schools because it didn't agree with a certain denominations or religious beliefs or something like that. And the question was, what would my solution or my reaction to that be regarding establishment and free exercise? And honestly, I think I that was kind of the idea that I was hoping to touch on in the paper that I wrote, was that I think that the way to address it is to start by not addressing it, if that makes sense. The idea that Carter said it too, of finding common ground. Um, I keep referring back to this Williamsburg Charter because when I found it, it was one of these, like, it was written in 1988, so way more recent than, of course, the Founding Fathers and their legislation and stuff like that, but long enough ago that a significant chunk of time has passed since it was written. But the principles and the feelings and the ideas that are shared in that charter, I read it and I'm like, where is this today? Like, this is exactly what we need. And so one of the things that they say is the debate about religion in public life is too often misconstrued as a clash of ideologies alone, pitting secularists against the sectarians or vice versa. And I think that is the very idea of what would my reaction be to that fight of establishment versus free exercise, when kind of the whole point is it shouldn't be that opposing fight of those two. And the rhetoric or the idea or the culture in our society that everything is me versus you, us versus them, it's a battle, I'm right, you're wrong, I win, you lose, is kind of where all of that will then fall short. And without that common ground and establishing those prerequisites of just respect and not intolerance, of respect and tolerance, and being able to understand that you're all trying to, with differing opinions on how to reach that goal, you all have the goal of hopefully bettering the nation. And so coming at it from that kind of perspective, I think would shift it being a fight or a battle on who wins and more of a sharing of opinions on what's the best way to do it. And so I honestly, I don't think that even just, again, Carter said this too, of like, you have to put yourself in the lens of, you don't just think for yourself and you don't just have your own opinions, but you should also think in a broader sense of other people, and you should be thinking outside of yourself and what benefits other people and what can help other people and what can help promote the growth of the society. And so I don't think that whatever my personal opinion is on if a book was presented to me and I thought this was appropriate or not is separate from the legislation that should be written about it. And so I think just fostering an environment of making it a conversation and a discussion rather than a battle is the way to address any issue that comes up like that.
Thank you. Lucia, I'm going to redact my question for you unless you really want to get to it,
I don't mind.
because I know that I put you on the spot by double asking. All right, we do have a question from our participants here.
So it really wasn't a question, but I just wanted to hand this to you all as students. I'm a nurse. I have been for 52 years, so I take care of all kinds of patients. What I want to say to you was that someone asked you about history and books and erasing things. Here's a good thing. You know, history isn't here for us to like or dislike. History is here for us to learn from. If there is something about history we don't like, how about we just don't repeat it? And this is what I tell my students. And the other thing of it is, if I look at all the religions on the face of the earth, if I ask any one of them which one is right, what do you think they're going to tell me?
Their religion.
Theirs. So my point, they can't agree among themselves. And so if you're talking about the Heritage Foundation, which is largely here, was a huge part of this Project 2025. When you look at Project 2025, it defines what religion is, it defines what a family is, it defines what male and female are, only two genders, okay? X's out anything else. If anybody had read it, they would have seen all of these things. But what does that teach us about people? Because this gentleman back here that gave me the mic, he was standing over there earlier and he said that the people that are doing all of this are very intelligent, very smart. And he's correct. They are super because they figured out humans. Humans don't read. Humans will go to their devices or anything. If they can get it in a skinny minute, that's what they want. A skinny minute and they're gone. It doesn't have to be evidenced or evidence-based. So you all need to get books and read books and then learn from books and stop listening to what you get in those sound bites. And I wanted to recommend, and these people are very well established in Utah and in the dominant religion, but they write, which I like when you write about something that doesn't necessarily agree with maybe what people might think. One of them is Religion of a Different Color, Race, and the Mormon Struggle for Whiteness, because whiteness is a thing. And that's written by Dr. W. Paul Reeve, chairman of the history department at the University of Utah. The other one is Everyone is African, and that's written by Dr. Daniel Fairbanks, and he is a professor here at UVU. These books are internationally shared. And the fact of the matter is, history is important. And you know it's important when people want to erase it. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you. One more time, please thank our student presenters today. And on behalf of the conference, we are now adjourned. Thank you.
At the very beginning. It's called the Movement Advancement.
Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you.